All right, so you should see that I've got the Hemp for Victory YouTube video up that you can look at after lecture one, part one. Um, we are going to continue on through the rest of the history of hemp and cannabis. So, talked about that slide with World War II. Around this time, there were a few other interesting things happening with hemp. Henry Ford, hopefully a name that you might recognize, or at least maybe the last name, big company producing cars, vehicles. They actually experimented with creating a car body with hemp fiber in it. And so there's a paragraph there, or I guess two paragraphs from an article back from 1942 that talked about what they did. It wasn't just hemp, so that bullet point can be maybe, I guess, I wrote it's made of hemp fiber, which is 10 times stronger than steel. You really have to read the finer details though of that article and see that it was 70% cellulose fiber, 30% resin binder. Even now cars are made, just with that body that is then surrounded by metal and other things. It is typically a fiber body, or people might call it fiberglass, things like that. This particular car had 50% southern / pine fiber, 30% straw, 10% hemp, and 10% ramie, which was a material used by ancient Egyptians to encase mummies. Weird fact. Not sure how they landed on this particular combination of materials, but it did show a lot of benefits. It did make a very well-made body for the car. That what the true statement is that the plastic material would absorb what they were calling plastic. It would absorb a blow 10 times as great as steel without denting. So that's what it means when it says 10 times stronger than steel, because you might be like, well, if I was hanging off of a steel beam or a beam made out of these different fibers, are you sure this wouldn't collapse? But it's more about how the impact, from a accident, kind of that impact and that power translates across all the fibers and that sort of thing compared to steel. So he did make a 60 horsepower Ford V8 engine vehicle with this. So it's just kind of again, fun fact of the ways we use hemp throughout history. But again, it was just a short time later, 10-ish years, that we've got the last hemp fields being grown. So again, I've got my red arrow just showing a downward production of hemp and cannabis. We've got the marijuana tax law in effect, and more stricter laws started to become present. Again, based more on marijuana, because again, that was using it as a drug. It's got the high THC in it that causes that psychoactive effect, gets you high. And that is what people had a problem with. But hemp, because it all came from the same plant, got grouped together with it too. So the 50s, we start to see a lot more stricter sentencing laws, with a sentence in prison, jail time, whatever, up to 10 years, with a fine up to $20,000, which was a lot of money at the time. Still is. And then again, just what you can kind of call this war on drugs happening, where the government feels the need to build more and more, offices, bureaus to kind of combat what they felt was an overuse of drugs So you have the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs created in 1968, and then eventually getting us to the 1970s with the Controlled Substance Act that thereby classified anything cannabis sativa as an illegal Schedule 1 drug. So it doesn't matter if it had less than 0.3% THC or more than it, all of this, anything from the cannabis plant was considered an illegal Schedule 1 drug, which carries some pretty heavy sentences and fines with it. So obviously that meant nobody wanted to grow industrial hemp anymore, because you could get fined or put in prison if you had the fiber from the plant, if you had the grain from the plant. Never mind the fact that you couldn't get high off of it. So the 70s was really a big time that the United States went from a supporter of hemp to completely banning it. So like I said, a lot of people kind of term this as the war on drugs, where you have the US government basically, kind of ending the production of hemp because it was included with cannabis, grouping it with other drugs like heroin and LSD, which were also under the Schedule 1 drugs. So again, farmers are not going to cultivate hemp then, because they could get in a lot of trouble with it. So you've got plastics coming through as a big alternative, not necessarily a sustainable or environmentally friendly one, but plastic, nylon, there's still a lot of cotton production. Unfortunately, all of these things that when we really look at it, are not as environmentally friendly or sustainable as hemp could be. So, again, just considering it from the side of, are we growing things that use less pesticides, less fertilizers to produce the things that we need? Are we producing synthetic alternatives that will biodegrade, not demand that a huge amount of land goes towards landfills, or, that we throw everything in the ocean? Honestly, in my opinion, we went the wrong way with that, where hemp could have definitely given us a sustainable alternative. We could no longer grow it. So this was, the absolute hard stop of no more hemp, because it was included with marijuana and the Schedule 1 Drug and Controlled Substance Act. So this was like 1970, just to show you again that the government was just huge on the war on drugs. You have the creation of, well, if you remember back in the 60s, 2 slides ago, I said that there was a Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs created. That was a merger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And then they actually had a Bureau of Dangerous Drugs that was part of the Food and Drug Administration. So they kind of merged together to create that Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. We have the Controlled Substance Act, 1972. There's the Schaefer Commission. This was appointed by President Nixon at the direction of Congress, and they considered laws regarding marijuana and determined that personal use of marijuana should be decriminalized. But President Nixon rejected that recommendation, and over the course of the 1970s, 11 states did decriminalize marijuana, and some others reduced their penalties, but that was at a state level. All right, at a federal level, it still carried some pretty heavy, negative impact with it if you were caught. The creation of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, all right, that was again merging the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, and So that is what we have today, right? Kind of have a stopping of merging of different bureaus. And so we have the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA today. So of course, again, thinking about my own personal childhood, we would often have, different, like come down to the cafeteria or whatever and get a talk on why drugs are bad. There's like a huge, beginning in the 80s, a huge parents movement against marijuana. And it wasn't like just marijuana, but that was a big part of it because, again, we also have a lot of maybe some commercials, maybe in magazines, I mean, who knows what, but rumors, whatever you want to call it, of using marijuana is a lower class thing, it's bad for you. If you use it, you're basically going to ruin your future. You're not going to be able to get a job and all of this. So parents started to have like a huge movement against marijuana. They were conservative parents lobbying for stricter regulation of marijuana and prevention of drug use by teenagers. Some of these groups became quite powerful, and with the support of the DEA and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, these were instrumental in affecting public attitudes, which led to the 1980s, again, war on drugs. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act made mandatory sentences, and this actually was now President Reagan signed this act, and it instituted mandatory sentences for drug-related crimes in conjunction with the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. The new law raised federal penalties for marijuana possession and dealing, basing the penalties on the amount of drug involved. So possession of 100 marijuana plants received the same penalty as possession of 100 grams of heroin. A later amendment to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act established the 3 strikes and you're out policy, which might be something you've heard of before. I don't know. I have heard of it mostly with my research into the history of all of this, but the 3 strikes and you're out policy, which requires life sentences for repeat drug offenders, providing also the death penalty for quote unquote drug kingpins. I do not know how they defined those people. But yeah, so 3 strikes and you're out. I'm not sure there was a whole lot of defining how much maybe you had in possession. But that is honestly, in my opinion, kind of scary to think about, that for some of these people, they might have been using it small amounts just for themselves for medicinal reasons, and getting caught with that, 3 strikes and you're out, you're basically in for life. That is honestly blows my mind, but you might have your own opinion on that. It just seems pretty harsh in my opinion. We're moving on in time. More presidents involved in the war on drugs. 1989, President Bush declares a new war on drugs in a nationally televised speech. This would have been the father to George W. Bush. So, we're kind of skipping ahead a few years here, but I mean, again, throughout this time, there just would have been a huge amount of, police conducting searches, trying to find people that have this. There would have been a lot of helicopters flying over California, a lot of the southern states, to find any illegal grow operations. So there would have been just a lot of funding going towards the DEA, again, police stations, officers that were all, their main goal was to find the marijuana and get rid of it. But 1996, so again, so laws are interesting. You kind of have this overlapping federal law here, which federal law is that it's illegal, but states can make, step down a level, states can make their own laws. So in 1996, California voters passed the Proposition 215, allowing for the sale and medicinal use of marijuana for patients with AIDS, cancers, and other serious and painful diseases. And so obviously within the state of California, having their own laws, it would have been okay for possession unless you were caught by a federal, a federal agent, then you would have to deal with the federal laws. And you definitely could not cross out of California, because that also makes you into the federal level where it would be illegal. So the laws are obviously standing in tension with federal laws that prohibit the possession of marijuana. They're still going to want, federally, they're still going to want to find what they consider to be illegal operations. So, like California trying to say like, hey, using in small amounts is very, very helpful with people with certain ailments. But federally, they were like, no, marijuana is awful. We still need to eradicate it. So when we get to talking about like the adult use recreational marijuana law that went into effect in New York, a big part of that is on social justice. And so to kind of give you a background of why we might have made a law that gives a little bit more benefit to the social injustices happening, it was just because the fact that war on drugs, you cannot deny that it was racially divided, that Black people were much more impacted by the war on drugs, that, and it was, I will say, it's different by state, and I'll give some data on that. All of this comes from the ACLU report here that I've got linked on the slide. So they do have like by state data, and it is different by state, but overall they can see that Black people were more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, most likely to have kind of a worse sentence, definitely to be involved with the like 3 strikes and you're out thing. So I just tried to summarize this like 50-page report here from the ACLU. They really only looked at data from 2001 to 2010. And remember, this was happening back in the 80s. So I would have to think that this is like exponentially worse, again, for different races. But nonetheless, just to give you some of the summaries from this. So again, just looking at between 2001 and 2010, there were over 8 million pot arrests in the US. So that's about 1 bust every 37 seconds, and hundreds of thousands ensnared in the criminal justice system. Again, super focused on marijuana. I mean, I'd have to say that, like, again, I guess you could say personal opinion. I don't know what taking heroin and LSD is like, but knowing what it does, what happens to people that are on it, I would think that that's a lot worse than people on marijuana. But again, personal opinion, I'll like put a little side note, Dr. Judd's opinion on that one. But if it accounted for over half of all drug arrests in the United States, that is definitely them trying to put, blinders on and focusing on marijuana. Enforcing marijuana laws costs us about $3.6 billion a year. Yet you could say that the war on drugs, the war on marijuana specifically, failed to diminish the use or availability of marijuana because people could still get their hands on it. Marijuana use is roughly equal among Black and white people, yet Black people are a little over 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. So again, seeing that kind of racial bias that, you see a group of Black people, you see a group of white people, and a lot of police officers, unfortunately, and I can't say every police officer, I know a lot of great police officers out there, but again, thinking decades ago, a lot of them would have focused more on the group of Black people and, searched them for marijuana. Again, data by states are different, but New York and Texas were the 2 states with the most marijuana arrests in 2010. 97% of those arrests were for possession. So a lot of people getting some pretty rough sentences. Again, in my own opinion, much longer sentences than what would be necessary, especially dependent upon the amount of marijuana they had, but nonetheless. So just to pull out a few of the states, they do have the table with all of the states plus the District of Columbia with the largest racial disparities in marijuana possession. So this is just the top, let's see what I put on here, the top 7. So right at the top, and so Iowa, they're comparing the Black arrest rate to the white arrest rate, and then figuring out the amount of times more likely that Blacks are arrested. So you can see Iowa, DC up there at the top, with Black people being 8 times more likely to be arrested than white people. But you can't ignore that there are differences in populations. Iowa probably doesn't have a huge Black population. Iowa, when I think of Iowa, I think of cornfields. But no matter what, looking at this data, you have to say that Black people were definitely biased against when it came to getting arrested for marijuana possession. And even with these top 7 states that I put up here, you can see it really only goes down to 5 times more likely Black people are arrested compared to white. On the states that I don't have on this slide, that are going to be, because it's as they go down the lower end of the spectrum, like Oregon is one of the lower states. It's the 5th lowest in the disparity, and they're at about double. Black arrest rate was about double compared to white arrest rate. So no matter what, even if you're considering that, like, DC has probably a lot more of a Black population compared to Iowa, like, in my mind, it just kind of makes it worse for Iowa, because it means that they were like definitely picked out among people in Iowa, to be like, I'm going to search you for marijuana possession. So it's just really unfortunate. These racial disparities exist. And so, again, just trying to set the background for when we talk about the social justice part of the new laws in New York. So just a few other things from the ACLU report. So again, these numbers are per 100,000. It might have been better if I had shown the table with this one, but so the Black arrest rate for marijuana possession was under 300 in only 2 states, Hawaii and Massachusetts, which those numbers are actually like following decriminalization. So it's not really surprising that those have decreased. But in comparison to the amount of white people arrested, most of those arrest rates were not over 300. They were only over 300 in 3 states, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Alaska, which again, probably not super surprising because the white population probably is much greater in those 3 states compared to the Black population. So there just would have been more white people to arrest. But again, just also comparing that most states were not over 300 and the amount of arrests of white people, and compared to Blacks, there's only 2 states that were under 300. So again, just a huge disparity between the races. So yeah, in only 10 states, the Black arrest rate was under 500, while in no state was the white arrest rate over 400. So arresting just a lot more Black people than white people. When you look at what they were like charged with, marijuana possession versus like dealing. I think most of this here on this slide is about possession, but the District of Columbia, DC, 91% of the marijuana possession arrests were for Black people. Mississippi, 69%, Georgia and Louisiana, 64 and 61%. Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana being those southern states. Again, not trying to say that everybody in the states are racist or anything like that, but there is always this underlying racial bias that's occurring kind of everywhere. Again, this puts a little bit more detail on about like the population makeup of some of these states. So like again, Iowa's probably pretty similar to that Blacks make up 15% of the population, but the number of arrests that were made were so large, so they account for more than half of the possession arrests. And being such a small part of the population, it just, again, to me, shows that they were really targeted for this war on drugs. Alabama, 60% of marijuana possession arrests were Black people, but Blacks account for less than 25% of the population. So again, just really targeting Black race, unfortunately. So I don't know. That might have really bummed you out. It always bums me out when I take a look at that data. It isn't even, it's a decade old or more, 2001 to 2010. So I can't imagine how those numbers might have changed over the last decade. But we do also have a lot of states that are decriminalizing marijuana possession or, approving use for medicinal marijuana. So hopefully some of those numbers might have gone down. But I just have that ACLU report. So anyways, we get to move on though into, closer to current times. So we have the war on drugs happening, the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. Fun fact, the US begins to import food grade hemp seed and oil in 1998. We could have just been growing that ourselves if it wasn't part of the Schedule I drug, from the Controlled Substance Act. But no, we'd rather pay the big bucks to import it to be able to use, which is crazy to me. 2007, the first hemp licenses in over 50 years were granted to North Dakota farmers. Again, this is just because states individually could make their own laws. And so North Dakota decided, again, with a lot of farmers and lobbyists asking for permission to grow hemp, North Dakota finally agreed. but they limited it to these like 2 farmers in the beginning. So not every state, it wasn't legal in every state. It's still considered a Schedule I drug. About the same time, Woody Harrelson, if you are, know him, he's an actor. He actually planted hemp seeds in rural Kentucky, and it was not legal in Kentucky, still a Schedule I drug. And so he was later arrested, but charges of marijuana possession were later dropped. I'm guessing just due to the amount of, like news reporting on this, that it didn't, these seeds didn't have THC, so it would not grow a plant that you could get high off of. It could have just been the fact that he was an actor and had lots of money and lawyers, who knows, but the charges of marijuana possession were dropped. And he then, this is 2010, so several years later, he did make a movie called Hempsters Plant the Seed. It does look pretty entertaining. It was on Amazon Prime, but that was like last year that I checked. I mean, I guess it probably still will be on there if you've got Amazon Prime and want to watch it. But it would have been a lot of, like Woody Harrelson saying like, let's take down the government, plant all these hemp seeds, and because it wasn't legal at the time. But it is now. We'll get into that. But it is now. So it's kind of already out of date, which is crazy. But at that time, he was being a huge rule breaker. You also see Mitch McConnell. His name involved a lot with hemp becoming legal again, because he was the senator from Kentucky that really like promoted hemp to be part of farm bills. So that kind of leads me to this next part. If you don't know anything about the farm bills, it's just a general term given to a group of acts and legislative laws that have to do with agriculture. And so typically senators from different states, some of them might work together, but they put forward like a bunch of new things that they want to be like put into law for farmers and people in agriculture. And we just call it the Farm Bill. And so Mitch McConnell did get hemp to be part of the 2014 Farm Bill. And by the way, these also come to the president to be signed every 4 years. So this can be considered the 2014 Farm Bill. And so what Mitch McConnell and a few other senators did was ask, can a few farmers grow hemp as long as they're partnered with a research institution, so that it's also kind of an experiment to see, can we grow this hemp again? How do we grow it? How do we grow it well? How do we process it? What can it be used for? So you had to partner with a research institution. And most of the time that was a college like us, like SUNY Cobleskill. But I'll go to my next slide. So President Obama did sign that farm bill, okaying the piloting of hemp farming. I'll put this YouTube video up for you to see too. And so what it did was it stated that hemp is defined as having that less than 0.3% delta 9 THC. And so that they could prove any part of this plant, would not cause you to get high. And the states in green were the ones that participated with this. So like Colorado, along with Kentucky and Tennessee, Indiana, Virginia, Vermont, North Dakota, Minnesota. They were kind of like the first, and Hawaii is there too, sorry. They were kind of like the first ones with their senators that were like, yeah, we want to be a part of this. So farmers, they did have to get in touch with, again, typically it was a university, So like in Colorado, it was Colorado State University, and farmers would be like, can we partner together? All right, I'll grow the hemp, you come out and do research on it, we work together, we report to the state, we let that, we do testing to prove that it's not marijuana, and then we also kind of follow along with the end product. If it's fiber, what do we do with it after that point? If it's grain, what do we do with it after that point? So these were really the beginning few states that were really involved with it, but it did open it up to all states to be allowed to grow hemp. Sorry. Interesting note here, though. Interesting note. This did not legalize hemp, all right? This gave the opportunity for farmers and universities or research institutions to grow it without getting penalized, but it did not pull hemp out from the Controlled Substance Act. So if, for example, you're in Kentucky, you are partnering with the University of Kentucky to grow some hemp, and the only person who has hemp seed, because they've again pretty much been doing this no matter what, say from California or from Colorado. Right, two states that had decriminalized marijuana, and so hemp was kind of a part of that, so they probably grew it all. Right, they have a lot of seeds, they have a big seed bank. Here in Kentucky, it hasn't been legal there, so nobody near you has any seed. So you contact Colorado, say, I'd like to buy some seeds from you so that I could grow them as part of the 2014 Farm Bill. All right, as it's making its way from Colorado, all right, to Kentucky, at any point, it could have been stopped. If it was getting shipped in, not necessarily that you buy a semi truck full of seed, but say some sort of delivery truck gets stopped in Kansas, Missouri, even to Kentucky, all right, they could seize your seed and you don't get it anymore because it is still considered a Schedule I drug, right? So you basically needed to let federal government know that you were shipping seed from there. It could still get stopped, and there's absolutely nothing you could do about it. You could like lobby the government. You could send a lot of letters to say like, hey, this is all by the book, and I'm not doing anything illegal. But because the 2014 Farm Bill did absolutely nothing in separating hemp from marijuana in the Controlled Substance Act, it was still federally illegal. So there's a lot of stories back then of like, and it's still, Idaho is still like the big holdout state that will like never decriminalize it. But there were a lot of people talking about Idaho stopping seeds and destroying them. So, like North Dakota, maybe ordering from California, right? If their seeds got stopped in Idaho, might as well call that a big loss because you're not going to see those seeds again. All right, so I will show that YouTube video that's linked here because it does talk about the people that really like pushed for the Farm Bill. A lot of veterans were involved with it, which were really cool because a lot of veteran farmers, wanted to find newer ways to grow different crops, or perhaps, new crops that might make more money, who knows, but there were a lot of veterans involved. So it's a pretty short video, but I'll link it in the lesson plan. But that's just a big thing to remember for the, this 2014 Farm Bill that allowed for the piloting hemp farming, but it still did not make hemp legal. So because people were having so many issues with this, for the few states that did want to be a part of it, which New York did become a part of it, maybe not necessarily right from the beginning, but we did start growing under the 2014 Farm Bill, working with a few different farmers of upstate New York. And we started with growing grain hemp before switching to CBD hemp, and then that's pretty much all we grow right now. But nonetheless, so there were a lot of people, again, like veterans, senators in the Senate, different lobbyists that were like, hey, to make everybody's lives easier for this hemp farming, we need to make it legal. We need to not be in the Controlled Substance Act. But nothing really came about it, or a lot of people still fought it. So 2015, a few farming acts went through, but they got stopped. 2016, Colorado farm earned the organic certification from USDA for its hemp. So kind of one of the first farms to do that. I'll also link the video here. I kind of assume that it doesn't come through very well in my recording of my computer screen and me talking, that I don't know how well a video comes through on this. Maybe it's perfectly fine. I don't know. But I'm just going to link it in the lesson so you can watch it after you're done with this. All right. It's just another pretty cool video that also summarizes everything I've talked about, from the history of hemp to where they were at then in 2016. That some businesses were getting involved with this too. Patagonia really wanted to use hemp fiber in their clothing. And again, because they also recognize how it could be a very good sustainable plant for our environment. So big companies like that were putting their money behind lobbyists to, again, help push through some of these legislation. But every 4 years, a farm bill, all right, with lots of different things to deal with agriculture comes through. And so 2018 was the next one, every 4 years, that we could put forward some new hemp specific laws again. So there was an amendment because the law, I believe in 2014, it was called the Agricultural Improvement, that included hemp in it. So this was to make an amendment to that agricultural improvement, and it would be of 2018, that would officially pull hemp out of the Controlled Substance Act. And so President Trump did sign that bill into law in December 2018. And so again, it defined hemp at a federal level of being less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC. It could be any part of the plant, the leaves, the stalk, the seeds, the flowers, the derivatives, right, the products of it, anything that was less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC is hemp, and hemp is no longer a controlled substance or a Schedule I drug. So that meant you could have a hemp plant sitting in your car, get pulled over by the cops and not get in trouble for it. I mean, you might get pulled to the station and they might have to do testing on it, but once you could prove that it wasn't a marijuana plant, you wouldn't have any problems because it was not a Schedule I drug. So it also made it easier for shipping products state to state, right? Because this is at the federal level. So again, remember, we've got federal level, state level, town, village level. All right, this is at the topmost level. Hemp is legal. States can make their own laws. So if you remember, I said Idaho is always going to be a black hole of hemp. Idaho said hemp is still illegal along with marijuana. So you cannot you really cannot ship anything through that state. So if you, thinking about the map of the US, if you are in Washington and need to get something over to North Dakota, you better head south around Idaho, or probably, I suppose you could head north into Canada. It might have to sit there a little bit for just plant inspection, but it's legal in Canada too. So yeah, that was a huge win for us. So we can officially say right now, because this was in 2018, that hemp is federally legal. Marijuana is not. It is by state laws. But anyways, so 2018 Farm Bill, excellent. Makes CBD products legal. It also helped make hemp be considered an agricultural product, which we'll talk about a few of these things like crop insurance. We'll talk about that. It means that banks are willing to work with hemp farmers and giving them loans in order to purchase, whether it's the land, equipment, or plants to start growing. But big win. And really the first huge push of, everybody wants to grow hemp. So not that that's necessarily a good thing, because with the huge explosion of interest, it did drop the prices, right? Back in the beginning, 2018, 2019, growing a CBD plant, there was a high price put on that plant, and you could sell it to a buyer at a pretty high price. But a lot of farmers got in on this, and just having basically more product than there was demand meant that the prices dropped. So the prices dropped a lot, but we'll talk about that too. So there were over 500,000 acres of hemp across 34 states in 2019 that were licensed. Again, just with that many acres of it, a huge amount of product, not enough demand. There were a lot of plants that actually were wasted, unfortunately. There were a lot of growers that didn't have a buyer, couldn't find a buyer. But it is still, I guess, a relatively good, industry with about $1 billion sales in 2019, probably about the same for 2020. It's probably going to stay around that for a while, but there's still a lot to do to kind of prove the health benefits of CBD. But fortunately, a lot of health centers have been doing that. So we'll kind of talk about that with the products. All right, so we got 2018, we're moving on into 2019. The other thing with the farm bills is that, they come out every 4 years. Some of them might change previous ones. Some of them might outdo it. It also means that after so many years, the older ones kind of expire. So because the 2018 Farm Bill it also did a number of things, not only separating out hemp from the Controlled Substance Act, but it also said that the USDA needed to establish national regulatory framework for hemp in the United States, unless states made up their own framework and submitted it to the USDA to be approved. So coming into 2019, we really either had to follow what the USDA in the state of New York, all right, we had to either follow what the USDA interim rules were going to be, or we needed to make our own rules as a state. Started thinking about that, this is about the time going into 2020 that COVID hits. So there's a lot of delays on things. Some of the problems that we were seeing with the first kind of framework that USDA was sending out to everybody was that they wanted to change the kind of definition of hemp. Instead of being less than 0.3% delta 9 THC, they were thinking it should be less than 0.3% total THC, which this actually would have been a big problem, because total THC takes into consideration the non-active forms of THC. So there's like THC acid form, there's like delta 8 THC, there's the precursor before THC, which is CBG. So it kind of measured all of that together, and no matter what, it was like impossible to have a plant meet that total THC is less than 0.3%. I could look through all of my plants that I've grown over the last 4 years. None of them would have been legal. And there's, again, a lot of lobbyists around to say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. You know, you are including the form of THC that's not even active, that doesn't get you high. And you're also kind of like assuming that the precursor would change to THC, and that's not necessarily going to happen. So it was just like really unfair. And it was really like, you know, how are we going to find a single cultivar of hemp that would fit this definition? So fortunately, there's enough comments on that, because again, if you're not familiar with how the government works, they would put out their kind of beginning thoughts on what the rules would be. They allow like 60 or 90 days for commentary, and then they either like fix up the law, change it, decide not to use it, or go through with it. And so there's a lot of comments made, and they fortunately took those to heart and realized that this probably wasn't going to work out. So fortunately, that idea went away. But 2021 comes around. They had given the states enough time to kind of decide what they were going to do, including New York. New York was really like wishy-washy on if they were going to just follow whatever the USDA says or if they were going to make their own plans. Finally, New York did come out with their own plans. They follow pretty closely along the USDA lines, but I don't know, in my opinion, I guess I think that they're better. I couldn't tell you why, but it's just nice to have our own state plan, I guess. So if states did not submit their own plans, then they have to follow the USDA rules, because again, as a federal agency, you know, overseeing everything. It did also bring up some other things like seed certification, ayahuasca, which I might get into that a little bit. I wasn't really planning on talking about it. I usually talk about that a lot more in the production class, but maybe I'll briefly mention it a little bit later. See if I can make a small lecture out of that. But testing labs. So again, no matter what you're growing, if it's hemp or I think even cannabis, high THC cannabis, marijuana, you have to get your plants tested, and it could be testing, you know, the amount of THC, the amount of CBD, but it's also going to be testing like the microbial levels to make sure that there's no bacteria or mold, which is good for people who are going to consume it. There's things like water activity. I'm trying to remember what else. I think those are really the big ones. So testing labs need to be registered with the DEA. That was kind of a new one. Before, testing labs just needed to be registered with the state. What we're doing is that we have to be registered with the state and then also with USDA. but the state is the one that decides who gets licenses. So we'll talk about that. So it's still the rule that Delta 9 THC needs to be less than 0.3%, but you need to have THCA or total THC needs to be measured and reported on your test, along with a measurement of uncertainty, which again tells you that these aren't perfect. It's kind of like a statistics thing, that it could be plus or minus this amount. And they're just going to kind of keep their eye on that. I suppose there could be things that come out in the future that say, you know, if that number is at a certain level, then maybe you need to like do something special with your plants. But as it stands right now, they're really just looking at the Delta 9 THC number. And if I didn't mention this before, if your test comes back that your plants are over that 0.3% THC, what happens is that you just need to destroy them. That is the rules. Those have changed slightly with the new 2021 rules, where you're actually given like a second chance. Well, actually, so I think if you test it while the plants are growing and it comes back higher, you have to destroy them. You also have to get it tested. So say you grow your plants, it's fine, you harvest, you send your flowers to go get the cannabinoids extracted. So you could have like a CBD tincture, right? Kind of like this. You still have to have that tincture tested. So maybe at that point, when they test it and the THC is too high, they actually give you a second chance, because you can easily, well, I mean, maybe not necessarily easily, but you can extract out the THC from tinctures. So you could do a run through of extracting some of that THC, send it in to get tested a second time. And if it comes back then, you know, under that 0.3% threshold, then you're fine and you're good to go. And you won't get in trouble for that. But it used to be at any point, if it was above 0.3% when it got tested at the lab, that was it. Get rid of it, dump it out, destroy it, set it on fire. You can't have it, get rid of it. So they're giving us a little bit of wiggle room there with that understanding that we can separate out CBD from THC and at the extraction level, so they could do that. So I think this map is pretty up to date, at least. Yeah. I would say it's up to date. I don't think that there's any new rules that have come out for those other ones. But so this is mostly just taking a look at marijuana, because again, we'll talk about those too. It is still a Schedule I drug. It is still under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. So it is still legal at a federal level, but each state has made up their own rules for this. So you'll see that like New York, you know, we do have it legalized now. Medicinal and decriminalized just means that medicinal marijuana is legal. So you've got to be registered for your medicinal marijuana card. And decriminalized means that they typically don't see any prison time with being caught with possession. There's some states that just have medical marijuana. There's some states that it's just decriminalized. There's some states that have CBD only at this point. And then there's still a few fully illegal states. So, I don't know. You can kind of see how it works out here. It's probably going to change over time. I kind of imagine, honestly, that every year I teach this class, I'm probably going to have to change this slightly, because more and more states are changing their minds on things. Again, it could be based on proving the medicinal benefits of it as a drug, as an actual like pharmaceutical drug. It could be as states realize what kind of profit they make from the taxes of it, that then they might decide to legalize it because then they can charge tax and make money off of it, which is honestly kind of what New York was thinking after seeing how like Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, how they've done it. They were kind of like, oh, maybe we can make a good amount of money. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the taxes involved, which are kind of crazy. So we'll get into this. I'll have kind of a lecture just on the hemp laws to really spell it out for you, and then a lecture on the marijuana laws. But there were a number of things that were being discussed during that like USDA interim time back in 2019, 2020. There were movement of like what agency in New York might be in charge of what. So actually, like hemp growing was still under, if you've ever heard of New York State Ag and Markets, right? That is the agency that is like our Department of Agriculture for our state. So hemp growing and processing and selling used to be all under Ag and Markets. But they started to move it so that processing and retailing, selling of any kind of hemp product was under Department of Health. I think especially if it was CBD, maybe fiber and grain still kind of stayed under Ag and Markets, but they started to move some stuff over to the Department of Health. And the Department of Health maybe had a big ego, maybe got a like big head, thinking that they were going to be in charge of all of this. So they tried to say that like hemp cigarettes were banned, that you could not sell hemp flower to the public. It had to be in the form of like a tincture or a lotion, or maybe even a gummy type thing, but not hemp flower or a hemp cigarette, because they wanted to basically ban the smoking of the flower. Now, I'm not necessarily like one way or the other on this thing, but put in my own personal opinion. Some people like to intake, all right, these cannabinoids as a smoke, as a vapor. It also wanted to like outlaw vapor, or like vape pens. So I think that they were thinking this would make it maybe younger, like teenagers, younger people, this would give them less access to that. Maybe it would make it look less desirable to them. I don't know. But there were a number of people buying hemp flower. So it was kind of like you're really going to hurt the people trying to sell a product then. Fortunately, as New York State made their own plan in 2021, we actually no longer, I don't really think we use the Department of Health at all anymore. They still have banned pre-rolled hemp cigarettes, but they did not ban hemp flower. So hemp flower can still be sold. Delta 8 THC products. So you might, if you go to like gas station stores, things like that, you might have found some Delta 8 THC products there being sold. It was kind of a loophole through the first 2014, 2018 farm bills, because they were really only specifying Delta 9 THC. So Delta 8 THC is produced by the plant in a very, very small amount. It can make you high in large amounts. So it can kind of be that psychoactive ingredient. But most of the products that are sold out there are actually like synthetically made delta 8 THC. So they're not necessarily derived from the plant because the plant doesn't make a lot of it. But it was kind of this loophole they found that like, oh, we can sell you a vape pen with high amounts of delta 8 THC and it will get you high. So, but we won't get in trouble because the law says nothing about delta 8. Well, the states are starting to realize that now. So most states have banned delta 8 products. They've also banned it kind of by saying like no selling of like synthetic products. It needs to be plant derived only. So that's another way to kind of prohibit the delta 8 products because they're typically synthetically made. So anyways, if you see some of the products out there, I don't necessarily suggest it. Again, I'm very wary of anything that people try to make in the lab. I'd much rather use plant derived things. So I would not suggest partaking in those. And hopefully the state is going through and finding most of them and telling people you got to take it off the shelf. For a while back in the beginning, 2015, 16, 17, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, they did not want hemp being infused with any foods or beverages. But fortunately, most of those cases it's allowed. And there's also some very specific regulations on the labeling, manufacturing, the laboratory testing, all of that we will get into when we talk about hemp laws. So anyways, that ends this whole thing to bring us up to now, where I still think that there's a pretty promising future for the cannabis industry. It might be a little bit more on the side of, marijuana, but hemp is still there. Hemp, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. CBD still has been shown to be very helpful, again, in like pharmaceutical drugs. So I think the FDA is going to look into that a little bit more. Fortunately, banks, insurance, all of that, even back 2-3 years ago, they were refusing to work with hemp companies, refusing to give out loans for people who wanted to start farming with hemp. Fortunately, that has changed. Again, the 2018 Farm Bill played a huge role in that. There's a new infrastructure for growing hemp to help farmers harvest and process their plants. There's, I think, always going to be a demand for hemp. It's not going to be huge, but there is always going to be there. We'll see what kind of happens with marijuana. It might see the same sort of like, a huge demand, but an even bigger production that's going to drop prices and demand will slowly go down. I don't know. We'll see what happens with the industry, especially since there's really not a lot of production of marijuana out yet, even though it was legalized. We'll talk about that. Everything takes a long time with government. So we'll be able to talk about what they have going now, what the law says. And again, things are probably going to change pretty fast for that because I think they are looking forward to opening up the licensing for growing marijuana this summer. So things could change slightly, but all right. I'll probably throw that YouTube video up there too for you to watch just separately outside of this lecture. But that ends the history of hemp and cannabis. So brings us up to current times, and then we're going to delve pretty deep into the current laws, which can be confusing, but we'll do, we'll go through that, talk about that, and yeah, that's kind of the plan for the first week. So thanks for sticking around and listening to that. I will end that here, and make sure you get through the rest of probably one more lecture for this week. There's a podcast up, and then there are the online quests or quizzes. So